And I would like to welcome our speaker. Kate Arneson is a research user interface and experience designer at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And her work focuses on applying human-centered design to research software projects with applications from chemistry and machine learning to genomics and healthcare. Kate collaborates closely with engineers, scientists, and end users to make research software and the process of building it better for everybody. We should have plenty of time for questions, so please hold them until the end of her talk, unless Kate says otherwise. Okay, I'll stop sharing, and Kate, you can take it away.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction there, Hannah. I'm going to share my screen with slides, but I also am dropping a link in the chat in case people want to follow along. And I've also included some link outs to various resources, some of which we'll discuss, some are more reference. But yeah, so if there are any people who kind of trickle in later on, I can drop the link in again. But just want to make sure that people have access to that in case that is a helpful resource. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right. So I guess about me and about kind of the context in which I work, Hannah, you did a great job introducing. So I don't need to spend a ton of time on this. But maybe one of the important things to note about my background and about the types of projects and products that I work on, most of them are in the academic research space, including one that I'll focus on for some of this discussion, which is iCloud BioFoundry. So this is a project that's for synthetic biology. Basically, it's a platform where users can come, design experiments using a chatbot for some AI assistance. They can also submit experiments through this platform and then run those experiments autonomously in physical biofoundries that we have at the University of Illinois campus. Unfortunately, because we have a manuscript coming out soon, I can't share the link to the actual platform for you to try out, but it's less important what the technical details of this project is. And it's more important just kind of understanding the context that it is a software product in the academic research space. So, whoops, okay, there we go. So that kind of leads into why I chose this topic for today's session. And if I'm kind of understanding the target audience for these CAS UDX sessions correctly, I'm guessing there are a decent amount of folks who are working in academic or research environments. And at least from my perspective, I think that this can pose some unique challenges, particularly in software development. So there are often priorities or pressures like publications or grants that exist in this space that might not always align with traditional software development priorities or ways of working that happen in industry. So many software teams in this space are lean. They might not have dedicated product managers, product owners, even project managers or designers like myself. And so without some of these dedicated roles, it can be hard to define a vision for the project. A lot of times this would fall onto kind of the product team. But if we don't have all those roles, it can be challenging. And even with those roles, it's hard in general. So what I wanted to share in this session is focusing especially on one particular approach that we found helpful for aligning our research software teams around a central vision, and that is a product requirements document. So we'll start out with kind of a brief overview of what a product requirements document or PRD is. From there, we'll move into how you might build one, leveraging some strategies from UX to help do this. Then we'll dive into an example of a PRD and some of the high-level sections, taking a look at some of the content that we developed for that iCloud BioFoundry project. Then we'll take a look at how we made this PRD actionable. So how to turn it into just something for documentation, into something that you can really use to help drive the project forward. And finally, I did reserve some time for an activity. I mean, we'll see when we get there if we do have enough time, if there are questions or other discussion things. But I did try and allocate some time where people can try writing out some of their own product requirements documents, some of those various sections. And yeah, so we'll do that before closing out the session. And that's where some of the links will come in that I've linked in the slides for those templates, but I can drop those in the chat again once we get there. Okay, so moving into what is a PRD? So a product requirements document, or PRD, is a tool that can be used to align research software teams around a central vision or scope for the product that's being developed. Atlassian defines it as defining a purpose, features, and behavior of a product, aligning stakeholders, and guiding development. So this all sounds great, but what does that actually look like, and how do we make these requirements tangible? So often a PRD is some sort of document with a few standard sections of content. You can see an example of that on the left. Sometimes it's even connected with task boards. User stories might go into one of the PRD documents, and then you can connect those to some sort of task management system. An example here would be Jira. In an ideal world, this is a living document, so it can kind of adapt and be molded over time to reflect new requirements as they come in and make sure it's still up to date with the product that you're trying to build. And okay. I just saw there's a message in the Slack, but I see it's Hannah sending some more links. Okay. So I guess with that being said, Atlassian, I've linked them on the previous slide. I've linked them here. They do have some great resources on PRDs. So I'd suggest checking those out if folks think this is something that they'd be interested in, kind of in their own time. But what I want to really get into in this session is thinking about what this looks like in practice, because implementing these templates can sometimes be more challenging than they at first would appear. So some of these challenges might be getting buy-in when using new platforms. So if you were to just open the Atlassian template, but you don't already use that platform, or you don't use Jira to manage your user stories and tickets, things like that, it can be hard to get people on board with using a new platform just to add some more documentation. So that's one challenge. Another would be, even if you are using these platforms, it can be almost a whole nother role to manage the tasks and user stories, and making sure everyone's on the same page. So especially in these academic and research environments where we don't have dedicated people to kind of oversee that logistical, administrative perspective, that can be a big challenge. The last thing I want to point out is the importance of maintaining a living document. So if it's so burdensome to update a PRD every time you get a new piece of information, no one's going to want to use it. And I don't think any of us want to add, a whole nother layer of work beyond actually doing the work. So those can be some challenges. So our approach with the PRD is just to keep it simple and flexible. So instead of using a different platform, we just use Google Docs, we use Google Sheets. So these were platforms people were already familiar with, already working in, and we could easily get different stakeholder buy-in. They could review it in their own time. It was something they already had access to. So we ended up using a Google Doc kind of toward the beginning of the project, just to align everyone around a central vision. But what we found was more helpful as the project progressed is translating this into just a Google Sheets that we could easily add more rows. We could move things around, reorder things. So that ended up being a more flexible approach that worked for us. I will go ahead and share 2 more links in the chat right now. These links are, let's see, okay. These are links to the templates for kind of the structure that we used in our project. We'll talk about them more in depth in the other sections of this session, but I wanted to share those in case people want to take a look at those. Okay, so even with these templates, it's not always trivial to fill it in with meaningful content. So I wanted to talk next about how you get there. So we'll briefly discuss 2 strategies that are useful for any project, but they're also especially useful for gathering and synthesizing content that will go into and shape a PRD. So one approach is stakeholder interviews. The Nielsen Norman Group, which is a leader in the field of UX, defines stakeholder interviews as a conversation with the person who has a vested interest in a project with the goal of gathering insights to drive the project's success. So this is likely something that probably all of us are already doing. So it might be talking with clients, talking with PIs, talking with researchers, but especially in research software environments where user groups may be smaller or more niche, these conversations can be an extremely valuable opportunity to gather preliminary insights about your users. Some tips that can help with this are clarifying the value proposition. So asking stakeholders about what this tool is offering to users that they can't get elsewhere, making sure that it's solving a real unmet user need. Another thing is you can ask specifically about what is known or what has been heard from users. So there can often be differences between what a stakeholder might initially kind of identify as a priority for the project compared to what users actually want. So asking this question in a straightforward way and can help stakeholders kind of reframe how they think about the project and how they might balance their more business oriented goals or publication oriented goals with what users are actually wanting. The last thing I'd mention is you can check and see if your stakeholders can help you identify users that you can have further discussion with, that you can run user discovery sessions or usability testing with. So some stakeholders are going to be pretty plugged into the communities that they're targeting for their product. So this can be a great way to connect with the actual people who will be using your tool. After gathering basic project information from these interviews, a helpful next step can be defining user groups. So at its core, this is just a lightweight way to define user categories and who they are and what they need to accomplish. To give an example, for the iCloud BioFoundry project, we had 3 user groups. One were general end users. So these are people who are designing experiments in the platform and submitting them to be run in the BioFoundry. But they do need approval by BioFoundry staff before they're run. The second user group is our administrator users. And so these are the people who would review, approve, and actually execute any of the experiments that were submitted. And our third user group is super users, and they're a little bit like a hybrid. So they would design experiments just like general end users, but these would be researchers who are actually at the University of Illinois, so a little bit more embedded in the process. So we wanted to give them the ability to self-approve the projects that they submit so that they can actually run those in the BioFoundry. So they have a little more autonomy. So this is just one example of how we kind of delineated different user groups based on the different needs that they had. And then we could make sure that the features we were building out would support all the tasks that they needed to accomplish. So just a few areas to consider that can help with defining these user groups is thinking about what goals they have. So what do they need to accomplish, not only within the system, but maybe within their broader workflows that happen outside the system. What are their prioritized tasks? So there might be overlap, as we saw, like both general end users and super users both need to design experiments, but they might have different priorities as well, even though there's overlap in their tasks. And the third thing to consider is what type or what level of domain knowledge do they have? So I think especially working in scientific tools or in research tools, a lot of the users already do have like PhDs, for example. So obviously the level of technical expertise influences how they will use a particular tool or system. So while we won't go into detail into these related methods, I did want to mention them because there are other methods out there in the field of UX for defining users, many of which you may already have heard of. But we won't get into detail here. So some of the most common ones might be personas, archetypes, user roles, user types, and user segments. So these different methods all have slightly different motivations, but really what they're getting at their core is figuring out how to make sure what you're building is going to support real users and real user needs. So user groups is just one way to do this. Okay. Moving into anatomy of a PRD. So now let's say we have some basic information about the project, we have some basic information about the users, but how do we structure this into a PRD? So we'll step through some of the key sections in a PRD using our work from iCloud BioFoundry as an example. And I, if anyone needs the link to the document, I just add that in the chat. I don't know if we had any additional people who joined late, but we can send that link again. But for this, basically, we'll be stepping through that PRD document template. So you can always just follow along in the slides as well. Okay, so starting at the top of our document, we have what's labeled as the executive summary. So this is just basic high-level information and status for the current product version and your PRD. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. You just have the product name, version, basic personnel dates. I think one thing that I would call out as being especially useful for our project is using this status field in a way that you can kind of delineate the pipeline of approval. So for us, we had a few different teams that needed to review our PRD to make sure it was all in line with what they were thinking. So we sketched out, like, let's say this leadership needed to review it. And then my team, as kind of the owners of this document, would make revisions based on any leadership feedback. Then we had all the research sub-teams. We had a few different sub-teams. They all also needed to review and approve this document. We'd make revisions. And then after that, we had a final approval date. So you can use this status as a way to kind of delineate that pipeline to make sure everyone is kind of working toward that final approval date in the right sequence. Sign off is pretty self-explanatory, just making sure that you have the key personnel on your project get their eyes on this document. This document isn't a standalone piece. We drafted it after having lots of meetings and conversations with the different people on our project, but just making sure that everyone is really bought into the central vision is going to be what makes a product requirements document valuable. If no one agrees to it, then there's no point in doing it. So that's why the sign-off part is important. Goals and objectives, also pretty self-explanatory. Just giving a brief description of the current version of the project. So the goals and objectives for, let's say, the MVP, the first release, might be very different from the goals and objectives of the project for, let's say, the 10th release. So really just tailoring that goals and objectives section to capture what are your goals for this current version and not necessarily goals for the entire project years down the road. And now we're getting into a little bit maybe more interesting parts of the document. So this user persona section, again, you can see there's a little bit of mixing in terms of terminology, but this just gives an opportunity to list out the different user groups that you've already identified. So for the iCloud BioFoundry project, we had general end users as one user group. We had those two others as well. But each user group might have a different priority. They might all be high priority, but for us, we really just focused on the general user group and the administrator user group for our first release, because that super user group was like a hybrid of the two. They could kind of flex between having two different roles assigned to them. So for us, that priority made sense. Then we just have a listing of the different high-level goals or tasks that they need to complete. In this case, all of these are things that the user can complete using our system. But it's also worth noting when there are tasks that they need to complete outside the system. So this can be an opportunity, as you can see, to start outlining what are things that they do using the product and what are things that happen offline, because that can kind of create the boundary between what's in scope and what's out of scope. The next section is functional requirements. And this is where I feel like it starts getting a little bit nebulous and it just gets easier, like the more you practice kind of delineating these things. But functional requirements are kind of one way to think of it, or what are like the key verticals or pages or kind of sections of the product that you're building. In our example, we had the public monitoring dashboard. It happens to be just one page within the application. So that's an easy way to just start thinking about it. What do users see on one page versus another? But the goal with the functional requirements is just to break things into kind of manageable sections of features or chunks of work that you can kind of, yeah, just break up your work in terms of understanding what users are doing in each area. So the public monitoring dashboard, in our case, was a place where people could go see a listing of all the equipment that was supported at the biofoundries, get status for each one, get images of the different devices, see how the labs were set up, that type of thing. So as you can tell, this is very different from the types of screens that a user would be seeing when they're actually designing their experiment. This is more for monitoring. So functional requirements are just a way to break up some of that work. And then we don't need to talk too much in detail, but these were just some sections that were useful for us to include in our PRD. So noting anything that's explicitly out of scope for this version of the product, noting any open questions. So especially at this phase when we're toward the beginning of the project is listing questions that we needed to be answered by other people. So we needed to get answers to these things before we could do our work and finalize the scope for the project, any assumptions and dependencies, and then manual processes and limitations. So here I said to note key actions and tasks that must be accomplished outside of the product. So I guess with these 4 sections, the main thing here is trying to leverage the fact that a PRD is going to be a central document that all stakeholders will review and approve. So you can use it as an opportunity to get buy-in and keep track of things that are out of scope. So it's in some ways almost as important for everyone to acknowledge what is out of scope versus what is in scope. Okay, so last section before we get to the activity. I know it's a lot of kind of me just talking at you, but I wanted to take a look at what PRDs are like in action. So let's say you've created a PRD document, you've gotten approval from all the project stakeholders. So that's a great step, but what happens next? And how does this translate into something that's really actionable? So for the iCloud Biofoundry project, there were 2 key outcomes that came after putting together that document that we walked through. So we created a table with the scope of and backlog of requirements, and we also mapped this into project milestones and timelines. So I have an example here of the table that we created. It's a little bit blurry, so sorry about that. But the first 3 columns you can see are functional requirements, features, user groups. All of those things came out of the document that we created. The table was really just about translating it into a more visual, a more visual layout so that you can easily see all of these items next to each other. And then the 3 columns on the right are really get into the scope. So we have a must-have column, a nice-to-have, and then future ideas. So basically this is the PRD document. It's just translated into a table because for our team, it was easier to take a look at that and see what is in scope and then what does that feature maybe look like later on. So it's really just about what's going to be most useful for your team. The second tab here is the backlog, and I think this is where it really was more useful to have it in a table than in a document. But the backlog we kind of reserved as a space for if any new feature requests come up that we didn't capture in the original PRD, we quickly can just dump them in here. So we might have new features because we did user testing and the users that we talked to had ideas about what would make this platform more valuable. So that's one place that new features could come in. I'm sure all of us have experienced the inevitable scope creep where clients will ask for more and more. So this is another place you can put some of those things. Just quickly jot them down, what meeting it came out of, who said it, what was the rationale. And then we could go back through and decide if we need to move them to the main PRD tab or if we can just leave them in the backlog and push it out to a future version of the tool. And then the last thing I wanted to mention here is we also were able to map out the milestones and kind of timeline for the project around our PRD. So each of these blocks you can see, well, maybe you can't if it's too blurry, but all of these blocks correspond to a functional requirement. So public monitoring dashboard is that first block. That's the one that we talked about a little bit when we were walking through that document. But basically, we were able to pull out each of those functional requirements, drop it into this waterfall chart, and use that to map out what we're going to focus on when for our design and development priorities. Okay, so that was a lot of talking. I wanted to reserve some time so that everyone here could also try kind of getting a feel for what it might be like to do a product requirements document. We can practice defining a user group, defining a functional requirement, and defining a scope. And for those of you who, I guess maybe one thing you can start doing before I drop more links in the chat is think about if you have a project of your own that you want to practice this for, or you can make something up. So the prompt I kind of made up here was pretend you're building a tool for managing conference submissions and reviews. I figured in this kind of space that we're working in, that's probably something that most of you have some experience with at least, but you can just make one up or pick something that you're actually working on. And I will switch us to this slide. Oh, okay, sorry. I see there's a question. Target audience of a PRD, team members, group leaders, or funders. So in our case, it was not for funders. It was for, I guess, both team leaders and maybe depending on how your organization is structured, maybe group leaders as well. But so this is the PRD that we built. As a designer myself, I collaborated with our developers and we really like spearheaded that effort. The motivation was that we had a leadership team and multiple research teams that we were collaborating on this project with, and they all kind of had different ideas of what the final product should look like. So we wanted to bring all of their ideas into one document and make sure that we could get them all kind of aligned on the same vision. So for us, the target audience was the people who are actually working on the tool day to day. So that was like the PI, the researchers, the designers, and the developers. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay. So I have us on this user group slide. Just to make sure, I think hopefully this is the last time I'll send it, but just to make sure that people have the templates if they want to use them. We'll be starting in the document template. So I'll set a timer just for like 5 minutes or so. And I want people to try thinking of a user group. So give it a name, just list out some key tasks that they'll be completing in the product, and list out any key tasks that they might have to do outside the product. So if you're going with the example of this conference submissions and reviews, my example was people who are submitting an abstract to a conference. Things they might need to do is submit the abstract, view its status, and a conflicts of interest. And things that they might need to do outside the product is draft the actual abstract or coordinate via email with collaborators. So that's just an example. I'll give us like 5 minutes. And as you're doing this, please feel free to unmute or drop in the chat if you have questions. And if you feel like you've gotten to a good place with your user group, if anyone's comfortable, like dropping it in the chat just so that other people can take a look at it and get some more examples, that would be awesome too. So I will set a timer and just let people work for a little bit. I see we have a question from Michael. Do you have experience with AI tools such as the Gloomy scale that are provided by Matt Pocock? I do not, but I am curious about what that is.
Yeah, I'll come on screen. So I've followed a bit of this. Matt Pocock is a pretty famous like TypeScript developer and does a lot of code, but also an educator. And he's been strongly involved in AI tools, generative AI tools. And one of the tools, he has a family of them, is called Grill Me, which basically takes a very skeptical view that you have actually described the product that you want to build. And so it asks you, it grills you. That's the grill part of Grill Me, right? And so repeatedly asks you and can end up generating, dozens of questions to help you identify a common mental model. And then there's another skill that is actually, create a PRD. Anyway, so I was just curious if you had experience with that because it seems, and I have not tried it yet. I'm just learning about it myself, but I think it's really interesting and an interesting approach to generating PRDs.
Yeah, that sounds like, oh, okay. Cool. I see Hannah's added a link to it as well. That sounds super interesting. I have not tried it, but especially if there's anyone in this group who happens to have tried it and has any um, thoughts or experiences with it, I'd be very curious to hear. But thank you, Michael, for sharing that
Yeah.
resource as
Yeah,
well.
sure, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Great. And thanks to folks who are sharing um, their work in the chat as well. It's awesome to see some examples. Um, okay, I don't think I clicked to the next slide yet, but um, we can kind of allocate another 5 minutes to do the next step. If you want to work on your user groups, you can totally keep doing that. If you want to check out the Grill Me Matt Pocock thing, you can also use that time to do that. I don't mind. Um, but otherwise, if you want to kind of head into this next section of the document, some things you can think about here. Give a name to your functional requirement. As I said, this one feels maybe the most nebulous, at least to me. But things you can think about are like high level pages, tasks, verticals, or areas within the application. Um, in my example, I was thinking about the abstract submission page, and then try and list out 3 to 5 key features within that functional requirement. So, for example, users might need to upload the abstract, review their attachment, delete their attachment, enter any required metadata, or submit their abstract. So I'll go ahead and set another 5 minute timer. If you have questions, thoughts, feel free to share in the chat. Other resources, like Michael mentioned, very open to sharing those around as well. So we have just about 1 minute left on my timer. So if anyone has any last thoughts they want to share or questions they want to ask before moving to the next and last section of the activity, it would be a good time.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you differentiate functional requirements from like tasks to be completed?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, I will say it does feel like a little bit nebulous. Maybe another example I could give from the iCloud Biofoundry project that we worked on. So the thinking about the general end users who would be designing an experiment and then submitting it. Oops, sorry, my timer's going off as we hit our 5 minutes. Okay. Um, Thinking a little bit about that general end user workflow, the functional requirements that we ended up splitting them into is like um, beyond the public monitoring dashboard, which was a little bit of an outlier. We had a functional requirement for designing the experiments. That happened to be in like a chat-based window that they could access later on, but that was one section of our functional requirements. Another section would be like actually submitting it for review because there were a few different kinds of modals and checks and confirmations that the user would go through for that functional requirement. We also, another one we broke it down into was monitoring like an active experiment. And then the last one is like accessing results. And so all of those things are maybe within the broader goal of either designing a workflow or executing a workflow. But we just split it into kind of smaller chunks that made it a bit more manageable as far as just grouping like related features that the user might be seeing or interacting with on screen. So it's maybe not the best answer, but that's one way we thought about it for our project. Right. I see some more examples in the chat, so that's good to see. And I don't want us to go too far over time, but the last part of the activity that I had is defining a scope. So this is thinking about translating some, at least for our work, it was translating that document format into the table. So basically, these are like the columns of the table. So if you are following along in that template, feel free to use that. Otherwise, the example here would be just picking a feature, one of the ones that you've probably already defined when you're doing your functional requirements. My example here is uploading the abstract, and then just describing scope at various stages of the project. So what's required? Maybe it's the ability to select a PDF from the computer. Nice to have, maybe it's dragging and dropping a PDF file from your computer. And the future scope is maybe we want to support other file types. So that's a pretty simple example. I'm guessing folks here are probably pretty comfortable already with defining scope for kind of different phases of the project. So we don't need to spend a super long time on this, but I'll just give us another couple of minutes in case people are wrapping up anything from the other activities as well. Okay, so sorry if I'm cutting anyone off from their activities. But I think I will just move us into the wrap up section just so that we make sure we get to final kind of like last tips and tricks. But again, I hope that you can use the templates if they're useful for you or revise them in a way that works so that you can consider using this in your own projects. But with that, we'll just move us forward into a wrap up section. So just as a recap, things we covered are really focusing on the PRD document as a strategy for aligning research software teams. We talked about how to get there using methods like stakeholder interviews or user group or defining user groups. And we talked about where to go from there to make things actionable. So in our case, it was the PRD table and the project timeline and milestones. Obviously, it might be different for you and your projects as well, which brings us to kind of the key tips. So flexibility is important. And so while I've shared templates and examples of what worked well for us and our teams, that doesn't mean that it'll work equally well for all projects or for all people. So the most important thing is finding something that works for you and your team. Otherwise, no one will want to use it. The next would be making it actionable. And so we talked about this a lot too, but just making sure that your PRD provides you with something that's really meaningful and useful that can help keep the project moving. No one wants to add extra busy work or unnecessary documentation that takes up a lot of time. We all have enough to do with our projects as is. So that also is related to keeping it manageable. So especially on teams where we don't have dedicated product roles, make sure that your PRD has enough information to be useful, but not so much that it's hard to maintain. And then the last important point is collaborating early and often. So buy-in from all the key project personnel is critical for any research software project, whether or not you're using a formal PRD, as I'm sure everyone knows. But just make sure you're collaborating with the essential people on your project so that everyone can contribute and feel like they are getting to have a say in shaping and aligning around a central vision or goal for the project. So I see we have one question. I will just move us to the resources slide before circling back to that. So anyone who does, if you do have the link to the slides, this last slide has further link outs to the various materials that we talked about today. So some of them are things we went into more detail on, some are more for reference. But please feel free to check that out, and I can work with Hannah to make sure that that link to slides are available after the session as well. So I'll just leave the slides here. Oh, and circle back to questions or topics in the chat. I see Dan asked, have you used this project or use this approach with projects where you need to describe deliverables in some detail a year or more in advance as part of the funding process? How do the two interact? Great question. So I have not personally been involved in a lot of the process leading up to like securing funding for projects. Often our team leads. I don't think we have any of the team leads from my company here today, but a lot of our team leads end up doing more of that project proposal and scoping. I would say, at least in my experience with the iCloud BioFoundry project, when I came onto the project before we had the PRD, it was like pretty vague in general as to what we were building. The grant is part of like a larger kind of umbrella grant. And so I don't think when they put the initial proposal together that they had to be super specific about the product we were building. They maybe had to say generally like high level goals will support like autonomous experimental design and execution. But it wasn't to the level of detail of the features that we're describing in the PRD. So I wouldn't say that they're like not compatible with each other, but maybe the like scoping documents that are used for proposals can be kind of a starting place and then fleshing out more detail in the PRD. So that would be my suggestion. But if other people have thoughts or experiences in this area, very open to others sharing as well. Oh, let's see. Alfred has a question too. People have been sorting out priorities successfully before they knew about PRD. Have we gotten any feedback from users about the practical advantages of the PRD? So maybe depending on the definition of users. So I will say the users that we've done actual user testing with the iCloud BioFoundry system, to them, they're just interacting with the end product. So they're not seeing the kind of messy behind the scenes or logistical like PRD documents. So we haven't gotten feedback from end users regarding that. If we think about users in more of like the internal sense, like who is using the PRD, so our developers or researchers on the project or leadership, I'd say I would say that we had like the minimum required buy-in from like our researchers and leadership. Like they reviewed it, they approved it, but they weren't super like hands-on beyond that. But from the UX designer and developer perspective, we had like, oh, I guess we have David here who was on the iBiofoundry project, but involved a little bit later on. But I will say, I think it really did help our design and development process. And especially that milestones kind of flow chart that we saw. That was really helpful because we did all of our kind of internal deadlines that we set for ourselves, like when is handoff going to happen between design and development for various functional requirements and features. It was all centered around that milestone chart, which came out as a deliverable or came out as a product of our PRD document. So it was very useful in that case.
Thank you so much, Kate. This has been really great. Thanks to everyone for sharing your examples and asking questions. I'll post the recording of this on YouTube and we'll share Kate's slides and links there as well. So you'll be able to keep accessing the resources that she shared with you today. So thank you, Kate. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.